Kieran Voss moved through the hallways of Lincoln Memorial High School like a shadow, his lean frame barely registering in the peripheral vision of his classmates. Standing at average height with sandy brown hair that perpetually fell across his pale green eyes, he possessed the unremarkable appearance that made him invisible to most and an easy target to others. His clothes hung loose on his wiry frame, and he carried himself with the cautious posture of someone who had learned to make himself small. The red brick facade of Lincoln Memorial High stood imposing against the Colorado sky, its Gothic architecture intimidating even the most confident students. Kieran had transferred here 3 months ago when his father's construction company relocated to Denver, and he still felt like an outsider navigating unfamiliar territory. The school's long corridors echoed with the sounds of teenage life, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on polished floors, and the constant buzz of conversation that never seemed to include him. What none of his classmates knew was that Kieran had spent the last 8 years training in mixed martial arts at his uncle's gym back in Phoenix. His unassuming appearance masked lightning-fast reflexes, devastating striking power, and grappling skills that had earned him 3 state championships in youth divisions. But his father had made him promise to keep his head down at the new school, to avoid the fights that had gotten him suspended twice at his previous school when bullies pushed him too far. The trouble started during his second week when Kieran accidentally bumped into Brett Hawthorne in the cafeteria. Brett stood 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders of a linebacker and the swagger of someone who had never been challenged. His perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive clothes marked him as Lincoln Memorial's undisputed alpha male, surrounded by a pack of loyal followers who laughed at his every word. "Watch where you're going, freak!" Brett had snarled, deliberately shoving Kieran hard enough to send him stumbling into a nearby table. The cafeteria fell silent as dozens of eyes turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Kieran's muscles tensed instinctively, his body shifting into a fighting stance before he caught himself and forced his shoulders to relax. "Sorry," Kieran mumbled, gathering his scattered books while his face burned with humiliation. He could feel the collective disappointment of the crowd as they realized there would be no show, no dramatic confrontation to break up their mundane Tuesday afternoon. Brett's crew consisted of 2 equally obnoxious followers. Jake Morrison, a stocky wrestler with a cruel smile and knuckles scarred from picking fights, and Tyler Banks, tall and lanky with the dead eyes of someone who enjoyed causing pain. They became Kieran's constant tormentors, appearing whenever he tried to find a moment of peace. The gymnasium became their favorite hunting ground. During lunch periods when Kieran sought refuge in the bleachers to eat his sandwich in solitude, the trio would corner him with theatrical precision. Brett would snatch his food and toss it to his friends like a game of keep-away, while Kieran sat helplessly, watching his lunch become their entertainment. "What's wrong, Voss?" Tyler would taunt, holding the sandwich just out of reach. "Gonna cry about it? Gonna run to mommy?" The words cut deeper because Kieran's mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, a fact he had shared with exactly no one at Lincoln Memorial. Mrs. Patterson, the geometry teacher who occasionally supervised the gym during lunch, would glance over with mild disapproval, but never intervened. The unspoken rule seemed to be that as long as no blood was drawn, bullying fell into the category of kids being kids, rather than something requiring adult intervention. The library offered no sanctuary either. Between the tall stacks of dusty books, Brett's crew would corner Kieran with whispered threats and casual violence. A sharp elbow to the ribs as they passed, a foot extended to send him sprawling, books knocked from his hands to scatter across the floor while other students stepped over the mess without acknowledgement. "You're pathetic," Jake would whisper as Kieran crawled around collecting his scattered papers. "No wonder nobody wants to be your friend. Even the nerds think you're weird." Kieran endured it all in silence, his father's words echoing in his mind. Keep your head down, son. Don't give them any reason to kick you out of another school. He had made a promise, and despite every instinct screaming at him to fight back, he honored that commitment even as his tormentors grew bolder. The worst incidents happened in the parking lot after school, where there were no teachers and no rules. Brett would shove Kieran against cars while his friends formed a circle, blocking the view from any passing adults. They would dump the contents of his backpack, scatter his homework in the wind, and force him to crawl around collecting everything while they kicked dirt at him and laughed. "Look at him," Brett would announce to anyone within earshot. "This is what a loser looks like. This is what happens when you don't belong." Other students would slow their pace to watch the spectacle, some filming with their phones, while others simply accepted it as part of the natural order. But something began to shift during Kieran's third month at Lincoln Memorial. It started with small things, his posture straightening slightly as he walked, his eyes meeting those of his tormentors for a split second longer than before. The change was so subtle that even Brett's crew failed to notice at first. The catalyst came on a Tuesday afternoon when Kieran was eating lunch alone at a corner table, trying to blend into the background as usual. Across the cafeteria, he noticed Elena Rodriguez, a quiet girl from his chemistry class, who always sat by herself near the windows. She had long, dark hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail, and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. Elena was different from the other students in ways that Kieran recognized instinctively. She carried herself with quiet dignity despite being largely ignored by her classmates, and her subtle smile when she caught him looking across the cafeteria had been the first genuine human connection he had felt since arriving at Lincoln Memorial. They began sitting together during lunch, sharing comfortable silences and tentative conversations about books, music, and their shared status as outsiders. Eleanor's presence gave Kieran something he had forgotten existed: hope that high school might contain moments of genuine happiness rather than just survival. Brett noticed the change immediately. His predator's instincts detected the shift in Kieran's demeanor, the way his target no longer walked with quite the same defeated posture. Rather than backing down, Brett escalated his campaign of torment with the vindictive creativity of someone who sensed his victims slipping away. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon during the lunch period. Kieran and Elena were sitting at their usual corner table, sharing a bag of chips and discussing their upcoming chemistry project when Brett's crew approached with theatrical menace. "Well, well," Brett announced loudly enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "Looks like the freak found himself a girlfriend. Tell me, Elena, what's it like dating the school's biggest loser?" Elena's face flushed red, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "Leave us alone, Brett." "Oh, how sweet," Tyler chimed in, reaching out to flick Elena's ponytail. "She's defending her boyfriend. That's adorable." Kieran felt something dangerous stirring in his chest, a familiar heat that he had been suppressing for months. His hands clenched into fists beneath the table as he fought to maintain control. "I asked you to leave us alone," Elena repeated, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. Jake grabbed Elena's chemistry textbook and held it high above his head. "What if I don't want to leave you alone? What's the freak gonna do about it?" He released the book, letting it crash to the floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "That's enough," Kieran said quietly, rising from his seat. His voice carried a note that made several students at nearby tables look up with sudden interest. Brett stepped closer, invading Kieran's personal space with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Or what? You gonna cry about it? You gonna run away like you always do?" The entire cafeteria had gone silent now, sensing that something different was happening. Even the lunch staff had stopped serving to watch the confrontation unfold. "I said that's enough," Kieran repeated, his voice still quiet, but carrying an undertone of steel that made Brett's eyes narrow with confusion. "You think you're tough now?" Brett laughed, but there was a slight uncertainty in his voice. "You think having a girlfriend makes you a man?" He reached out to shove Kieran backward, the same move that had humiliated him dozens of times before. But this time, Kieran didn't stumble. This time, he stood his ground with the quiet confidence of someone who had been holding back far too long. The push barely moved him, and Brett's eyes widened in surprise at his target's unexpected stability. "Touch her again," Kieran said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria, "and you'll regret it." Brett's face twisted with rage at being challenged in front of the entire school. "You threatening me, freak?" He pulled back his fist, intending to end this embarrassing display of defiance with a quick punch to Kieran's face. He never saw the counter coming. Kieran's right hand moved with the speed and precision of 8 years of dedicated training, intercepting Brett's punch and trapping his wrist in an iron grip. Before Brett could react, Kieran's left hand shot forward in a palm strike that caught him square in the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and doubling him over. The cafeteria erupted in gasps and shouts as Brett stumbled backward, clutching his stomach and wheezing desperately for breath. Jake and Tyler rushed forward to help their leader, but Kieran had already shifted into a combat stance that spoke of serious training and dangerous competence. Jake threw a wild haymaker that Kieran ducked easily, responding with a leg sweep that sent the wrestler crashing to the floor. Tyler tried to grab Kieran from behind, but found himself flipped over Kieran's shoulder and slamming into the tile with bone-jarring force. Brett had recovered enough breath to charge forward with a roar of rage, but Kieran sidestepped the clumsy attack and delivered a precise kick to the back of Brett's knee that sent him crashing face first into a nearby table. Food and plastic trays scattered everywhere as Lincoln Memorial's alpha male lay groaning among the debris. The entire sequence had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime to the stunned audience. Students stood on chairs and tables to get a better view. Phones appeared to record the aftermath, and excited chatter began to fill the air as everyone tried to process what they had just witnessed. Brett struggled to his feet, his face red with humiliation and his expensive shirt stained with cafeteria food. "You're dead," he snarled, spitting blood from where he had bitten his tongue. "You're fucking dead." Kieran stepped forward, and Brett instinctively backed away despite his threats. "No," Kieran said calmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm tired of running, I'm tired of hiding, and I'm tired of letting you hurt people." Jake and Tyler flanked their leader, all three of them breathing heavily and looking far less confident than they had moments earlier. They outnumbered Kieran 3-1, but something in his stance and the way he had effortlessly dismantled their first attack made them hesitate. "This isn't over," Brett warned, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Kieran replied, "unless you want me to show everyone else what I just showed you." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other while the entire cafeteria held its breath. Then Brett jerked his head toward the exit, and his crew followed him in a retreat that looked suspiciously like running away. The cafeteria exploded in noise as soon as they left, students chattering excitedly about what they had witnessed. Kieran felt Elena's hand slip into his, her touch grounding him and reminding him that he had something worth protecting now. "Thank you," she whispered, and the gratitude in her voice made every moment of restraint worth it. Word of the cafeteria confrontation spread through Lincoln Memorial like wildfire. By the end of the day, Kieran had transformed from invisible nobody to reluctant celebrity. Students who had never acknowledged his existence suddenly wanted to know his name, his story, where he had learned to fight. But Brett wasn't finished. The humiliation of being defeated in front of the entire school had wounded his pride in ways that demanded vengeance. He spent the weekend plotting with his crew, recruiting additional muscle from the football team and planning an assault that would restore his reputation while putting the upstart back in his place. Monday morning brought ominous whispers through the hallways. Brett had been telling anyone who would listen that Kieran had gotten lucky, that 3 against 1 wasn't a fair fight, that he intended to settle things properly. The rumors grew with each telling until they reached Kieran during third-period chemistry. "He's planning something big," Elena warned, as they worked on their lab experiment. "My friend Jessica heard him talking to the football players. They're going to corner you somewhere public, make a show of it." Kieran nodded grimly. He had expected retaliation, but the scale of what Brett was planning exceeded even his pessimistic expectations. "When?" "Today, after school, in the main courtyard where everyone gathers before the buses arrive." The main courtyard was Lincoln Memorial's social hub, a large open space surrounded by benches where students congregated before heading home. It was visible from the main office, the library, and most of the ground floor classrooms, ensuring maximum audience for whatever spectacle Brett had planned. As the final bell rang, Kieran made his way toward the courtyard with steady steps and a calm heart. He could have avoided the confrontation, could have slipped out a side exit and walked home through the back streets. But he was tired of running, tired of letting bullies dictate his choices through fear and intimidation. The courtyard was already packed with students when he arrived, far more than usual for a Monday afternoon. Word had clearly spread about the impending confrontation, and Lincoln Memorial's student body had turned out in force to witness either Kieran's triumph or his destruction. Brett stood in the center of the courtyard with an expanded crew that included 4 football players, their Letterman jackets marking them as the school's athletic elite. They formed a loose circle, blocking the exits and ensuring that their target couldn't escape without going through them. "There he is," Brett called out, his voice carrying clearly through the crowd. "Lincoln Memorial's tough guy. Let's see how tough you really are." The circle tightened as Kieran walked forward, students pressing in from all sides to get a better view. He could see Elena near the library windows, her face pale with worry, and several teachers beginning to notice the unusual gathering. 6 against 1, Kieran asked, his voice steady despite the odds. "Seems about right for your style." Brett's face darkened at the implied cowardice. "You got lucky last time. This time there's nowhere to run." "I'm not running," Kieran replied, settling into the familiar stance that had served him well in dozens of tournament fights. "But you might want to." The first attacker came from his left, a linebacker named Marcus, who rushed forward with the blind confidence of someone accustomed to overpowering smaller opponents. Kieran stepped aside at the last moment and drove an elbow into the football player's ribs, sending him stumbling into the crowd of spectators. 2 more came simultaneously from different directions, but Kieran had trained for multiple opponents since he was 12 years old. He caught the first with a spinning back kick that doubled him over, then grabbed the second and used his momentum to throw him into a nearby bench. The crowd roared with excitement. Phones appeared to record the action, and Kieran could hear Elena cheering his name from somewhere in the press of bodies. He felt alive in a way that months of hiding and restraint had nearly made him forget. Brett and his remaining crew approached more cautiously now, having witnessed their backup systematically dismantled, but pride and reputation demanded they press forward, even as doubt crept into their eyes. Jake tried to tackle Kieran around the waist, but found himself caught in a sprawl that ended with his face pressed into the concrete. Tyler threw a desperate punch that Kieran caught and countered with a wrist control technique that sent the taller boy spinning away with a yelp of pain. That left Brett standing alone in the center of the courtyard while his entire crew lay groaning around him. The crowd had gone silent, sensing that the real confrontation was finally about to begin. "Just you and me now," Kieran said, advancing with the patient confidence of a predator who had finally decided to stop playing with his food. Brett threw everything he had into a wild combination of punches, but months of bullying had made him sloppy, while Kieran had spent years perfecting his technique. Every attack was deflected or avoided, every opening exploited with surgical precision. A perfectly timed uppercut lifted Brett off his feet and sent him crashing backward into the fountain that served as the courtyard's centerpiece. Water splashed everywhere as Lincoln Memorial's former king landed in the shallow pool, soaked and defeated, while his entire kingdom watched. Kieran stood over his fallen tormentor, breathing heavily but clearly in control. Brett struggled to sit up in the fountain, water dripping from his hair and his face twisted with humiliation and rage. "Please," Brett gasped, all pretense of toughness finally stripped away. "Don't." For a moment that stretched into eternity, Kieran stood poised to deliver a final devastating blow that would cement his victory and ensure that Brett never bothered him again. His fist was clenched, his target was helpless, and the crowd was baying for blood. Instead, he stepped back and extended his hand. "Get up," Kieran said quietly. "It's over." Brett stared at the offered hand with confusion and suspicion, but eventually reached out and allowed Kieran to pull him from the fountain. They stood there for a moment, dripping and exhausted, while the entire school watched in stunned silence. "We done?" Kieran asked. Brett nodded slowly, unable to meet his former victim's eyes. "We're done." The crowd began to disperse as the show ended, but Kieran could feel the shift in how people looked at him, talked about him, acknowledged his presence. He was no longer invisible, no longer a target, no longer afraid. Elena appeared at his side as the courtyard emptied, her smile bright enough to make the entire confrontation worthwhile. "You did it," she said, taking his hand. "We did it," he corrected, squeezing her fingers gently. "I couldn't have gotten here without you." Over the following days, Lincoln Memorial settled into its new social order. Brett and his crew gave Kieran a wide berth, their former arrogance replaced by grudging respect and the wisdom that comes from learning one's limitations the hard way. Other students who had once ignored Kieran now nodded when they passed him in the hallways, and several even approached to ask about his martial arts background. Most importantly, the culture of casual cruelty that had defined the school's social hierarchy began to crack. Students who had once been targets found their voices, emboldened by Kieran's example. Teachers who had previously ignored bullying incidents suddenly seemed more willing to intervene when they witnessed harassment. On Friday afternoon, as Kieran and Elena sat at their usual corner table in the cafeteria, Brett appeared without his usual entourage. He stood awkwardly for a moment, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally to someone accustomed to solving problems through intimidation. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "For everything. You didn't deserve any of that." Kieran studied his former tormentor's face, searching for signs of deception or ulterior motive. But Brett's regret appeared genuine, the product of hard-earned wisdom rather than calculated manipulation. "Apology accepted," Kieran said. "Just remember how it felt to be on the other side." Brett nodded and walked away, leaving behind a tension that had defined Kieran's entire experience at Lincoln Memorial. As Kieran watched him go, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The months of fear and humiliation, the decision to finally stand up for himself and those he cared about, and the discovery that strength without compassion was just another form of bullying. He had learned that true victory wasn't about proving his superiority or humiliating his enemies, but about finding the courage to be himself and protect the people who mattered to him. The quiet storm that had raged within him for so long had finally found its voice, and Lincoln Memorial High School would never be the same.